the studio. Lord Lamont, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's start, first of all, with the resignation of Lord David Frost. What was your reaction? Were you surprised as everyone else?
Well, I was shocked, and then I realised I shouldn't be surprised because he had trailed it a little bit in a speech he made at the Königswinter conference, the Anglo-German conference. But I was shocked because I think it leaves the job not completed. The Northern Ireland Protocol is very problematic. You have this issue of goods going from the mainland here, GB, to Northern Ireland, having to have all sorts of checks. That is interrupting business, has caused some businesses to stop supplying to Northern Ireland. And then, of course, you have the so-called democratic deficit, that you have European laws being applied in Northern Ireland in which the citizens of Northern Ireland have no say. So there was quite a lot of stuff that still had to be negotiated. So I was disappointed. I very much admire Lord Frost. I think he's very, very good. But I was sad that he left. And I think there are some very big issues which Liz Truss will now have to try to resolve. But of course, she is very, very busy as Foreign Secretary anyway. To have this on top of it is quite a mouthful.
Indeed, and with international aid, of course, within the Foreign Office now as well. He was called Frosty the No Man. It was what he was branded in Brussels. They've seen him as quite hostile. In fact, some European officials seemed quite pleased that he was resigning. One quoted in the Times today said, "This is a great present. Frosty has melted at last. Is there a Brexit thaw in Downing Street?" Do you think those in Brussels and elsewhere will be pleased with Lord Frost's resignation?
Well, I don't think Liz Truss will be a pushover. I think they'll get a bit of a shock if they think that. I don't think Lord Frost was aggressive or unreasonable. I think we had some contradictions in the protocol. The protocol, you know, was never the finished document, the finished article. There were some loose ends there. You read the text, you can see that it was plainly envisaged that some further changes would be made. And indeed, there are provisions within the Northern Ireland Protocol that say if it's not working satisfactorily, if it's working against the interests of one party, they are entitled to suspend and to discuss those provisions. That's all written into the protocol, so one shouldn't have been surprised that the British government was taking action to try and get these problems sorted out.
I mean, this was a deal, though, that Lord Frost himself negotiated. I mean, his critics would say that, you know, frankly, in the end, Northern Ireland was chucked under a bus, despite the promises, simply because Boris wanted to get Brexit done.
But what I'm saying is that if you read the document, it is perfectly clear that there are some unfinished items in it. So, you know, that doesn't mean that the government are changing their minds or ratting on something that they had signed up to. There plainly were going to be further discussions anyway on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And indeed, part of it even envisaged that the document itself might be superseded by another document. So, you know, it isn't a case of Britain ratting on its obligations.
Let's move away from the protocol if we can, because Lord Frost has insisted that him and the Prime Minister are on the same page, essentially, when it comes to Brexit. What he did talk about, though, is big policy differences, not least on high tax. And he referenced that, of course, in that speech that you made as well a couple of months ago. Clearly, you know, this is someone on the right of the party who's not very comfortable with this government, which is increasing taxes to the highest level since, the 1950s.
Yes, I don't like high taxes myself. I think the policy of a Conservative government ought to be to have the lowest possible competitive taxes. But let's be fair to the government on this. When people, as you've just said, say that we've got the highest taxes since 1945, the war, we've been through a situation rather similar to a war, and the government has had to spend huge amounts of money. It had no choice. It had an obligation unless the economy was going to collapse, and they've spent nearly £400 billion on the furlough scheme, the bounce-back loans, all the aid to industry, keeping people in jobs, as a result of which we have very good low unemployment despite having had the lockdown. It's not surprising that first public expenditure as a total has gone way, way up. It'll come down again as the economy recovers, and it is already, as a proportion of GDP, coming down as the economy recovers. But as public spending has gone up, so taxes have had to go up. The government have taken some of it in terms of long-term borrowing, but it can't take it all. That would be reckless. It would be stupid. You know, Mrs. Thatcher always used to say, getting deficits down comes first before other things.
In saying that, Lord Frost, we know, was very close to Boris Johnson. Those within government suggest that actually he's one of the few people he can rely on. It is a significant blow, isn't it? You know, Boris Johnson's not got lots of political friends, and yet one of them seems to have left his cabinet because he doesn't agree with the direction of the government. That's quite a big blow for the Prime Minister, isn't it?
Well, I think it is a problem. And although I have tried to explain why I think taxes are high, I think a lot of Conservative backbenchers are a bit unreasonable about this. But the problem is that Lord Frost is on the same page as them, or seems to be. He didn't actually make this point in his resignation letter. I think you're building on a lot of things that were perhaps in the Königswinter speech or have just been rumoured to be the case. But if that is Lord Frost's viewpoint, I think that does create some problems for the Prime Minister, because it's also the view of some backbenchers.
Now, one of the things he did mention in the letter, though, is the restrictions. It's clear that, you know, he was not terribly happy with even the suggestion last week, or the vote on bringing in Plan B. I think it's fair to assume he would not be in favour of further restrictions in the lead up to Christmas. I mean, what's your sense? You know, you've been at the heart of government. No one's denying that these decisions are easy. In fact, you know, this is probably one of the most difficult decisions Boris Johnson yet again is going to have to make after a series of difficult decisions. What's your sense of the judgment about where you think he should be on this?
Well, I hope we won't have mandatory restrictions before Christmas. I think that would be extremely unpopular. But, you know, you've got to give Boris some credit. He has, in July, I think, ignored the advice of some people on stage, some of the scientists, and went for a far looser regime than was being advocated by many of the so-called experts. And that worked pretty well. With the Delta variant, we were doing fine. It was levelling off. Hospitalization rates and death rates were actually falling until Omicron came along. So I think the Prime Minister is quite prepared to face some of the experts down if he thinks that is the right thing to do. I would think it would be a big mistake to introduce something that was statutory, that demanded the recall of Parliament. I think that would be very, very problematic. I think at most you could perhaps have some further guidance or some suggestions, but I don't think you should go beyond that at this stage. But let me say this about this variant of coronavirus. Although some people think the evidence from South Africa suggests that the death rates and hospitalization rates will be lower, if it is 50% faster in spreading, then a much smaller number of cases of hospitalization can arise very, very quickly. A bigger ratio, a smaller ratio on a larger number. And that can create, with the bunching of hospitalizations, huge problems for the health service.
Yeah.
And that is the argument that I think actually is the knockdown argument.
Essentially, if millions of people all have it at the one time, it becomes a very difficult thing. Just two final questions. Just on that point, and we heard it in the news bulletin there, hospitality are crying out for help. Other businesses are as well, because they're saying they're the worst of all worlds, which is, i.e., they're still open because the government's not told them to shut down, but lots of people are cancelling events in the run-up to Christmas and dinners. Surely the government has to do more to help those businesses.
Well, I'm not against targeted relief for certain sectors that face acute problems. I would be very strongly against reintroducing the furlough scheme or general assistance to industry. If we're going to learn to live with this virus, then we've got to learn to live with it, and that includes business. But I think the hospitality industry is under some unique pressure, really, and I think there is a case for looking at some further help for it.
And just very finally, you've been in politics for a long time. Last week, when we look back at it, one of the largest rebellions a Conservative Prime Minister has seen in years, the loss of a by-election in a pretty spectacular swing, the resignation of a key government minister, and all these allegations that seem to not go away about what happens with cheese and wine in Downing Street and political parties. How difficult was last week for Boris Johnson, just in terms of historical political weeks that have been difficult for Prime Ministers in the past?
Well, I'm sure you remember very well Harold Macmillan's famous remark when he was asked what he most feared, and he just said, "Events, dear boy, events," and that's exactly what's happened. It was a big rebellion, but don't forget, there have been bigger rebellions. Tony Blair had an even bigger rebellion. He didn't stop him going to war with Iraq and being in Prime Minister for another 5 years.
So are you optimistic, or What's your sense? People writing off Boris too early, I suppose, is my question.
I think they are writing him off too early. I think it would be madness to have a leadership election. I hope the Conservative backbenchers won't contemplate that. Perhaps the Prime Minister's lost a couple of his 9 lives, but he's still there.
Okay.
And I also think that in the long run, if we get through without having a huge health crisis, people may look back on this and really be quite impressed with how the government has steered through this ever-changing crisis.
Okay, Lord Lamont, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming in. Lord Lamont there joining us on fascinating politics at the moment.